Greetings to this online course. My name is Elisabeth Hollender. I'm professor for Jewish studies at Frankfurt University in Germany. And we're going to look today at Ashkenazic liturgical manuscripts, specific one manuscript from the collection of the Katz Center. The course has 5 units. The first one will be very, very general about questions of what is contained in these liturgical manuscripts. We will then continue with the different types of texts and the way that they're presented in the manuscripts. Then the different prayer rites and how to recognize which one the manuscript belongs to. And the last units will be very specific about this manuscript, seeing how it's adapted to the changes in the rite and other physical interventions in the manuscript. So we're talking about liturgy, and we're only talking about the texts of liturgy. No gesture, objects, or something like that. We will limit ourselves to Ashkenaz, that is basically the German-speaking countries, although similar rites were used in northern France, England, and probably the lower countries. We will look at medieval times only. There's a lot of changes in the liturgy at the beginning of early modern period, and we will just not look at that. And we will focus on the high holidays because that is what our manuscript is actually containing. So let's clear a few things about terminology. When today we're talking about prayer books, we have the Siddur, which is a 1-volume item that contains prayers for weekdays and for Shabbat. It contains only the prayers, and it's used by the individual who's taking it to synagogue and reading from it the prayers there. We also have the Mahzor, which is usually a multi-volume set with 1 volume per holiday. It has prayers, and in addition to the prayers, and there's more prayers on holidays than there's on a normal weekday, it also has a lot of liturgical poetry. And there's a lot of repetition between the different volumes of one set. Unlike in modern times, in medieval times, we have only one person in the synagogue who really needs a written text in front of him. Everybody knows the prayers, especially, of course, the person who's leading the prayers, the chazan, or presenter, if you want to use the Latin word. So he has a book in front of him, a manuscript, a large one, propped up. And that will be what we're calling a Mahzor. And that has not so much the prayers in them, although some of the prayers that are special for the holiday can be contained in that manuscript. That has a lot of the liturgical poetry. It can contain a few other texts that the chazan may need to read, but mainly we're talking about texts that he really needs to perform. So all these texts fit into 1 volume, although we do have copies that have 2 volumes. And then they would be cut like in the middle of the year. So the first volume would be for spring, and then the other volume would be for the high holidays in the autumn. So the manuscript that we're looking at today is exactly one of those second volumes of a set. It's a Mahzor for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, from Western Ashkenaz. That's basically the Rhineland in Germany, somewhere in that area. It was copied in the 14th century on parchment, as all liturgical manuscripts in Ashkenaz were using. It has leaves that are a bit larger than letter format, with an average of 21 lines per page. The script is a square Ashkenazic script, very typical for liturgical manuscripts. And also the vocalization that we see is typical for liturgical manuscripts in that it's a simplified vocalization. This is not what we have in Bible manuscripts. They're using less vowels, which makes it easier for the chazan to read and perform it. The manuscript as we have it in front of us today is damaged. It's missing the first part and it's missing something at the end. It's beginning actually only in the middle of the last service of the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So quite a lot is missing in the beginning. And then in the end, it's missing all of Simchat Torah and the last few leaves of Shemini Atzeret. So probably instead of the 251 leaves that we already have now, we actually had something like 320 leaves in those days when the manuscript was complete. In addition to the end and the beginning missing, we also have a few pages in the middle of the manuscript that actually are missing, and we're going to talk about that in the last unit. If we're looking at the contents of a Mahzor manuscript, as I said before, mostly it is liturgical poetry, hardly any prayer. And the piyutim, the liturgical poems that are transmitted, are used by the chazan. So he's he alone is actually singing these texts in front of the audience. So the manuscript serves him. It's supposed to make recitation of the texts possible. And we will see when we look at some of the other pages how important layout of the page is. What can be done in order to make it easier for a chazan to read these texts. Liturgical poetry was composed for all holidays. The earlier one was composed in 7th century Israel under Byzantine rule, and a lot of these texts actually came to Europe. So they're the core of the manuscript. They're the core of the liturgy as we have it. So in addition, there were piyutim composed also for other events. For the minor holidays, especially for second days of holidays. And then we have even piyutim written for life cycle events, like the circumcision on a Shabbat or the Shabbat in the wedding week. These texts are written later, and they are where we will find variance between the different rites. If we're looking at a holiday, we have piyutim in the different services. We have piyutim in the evening service for the recitation of the Amidah. They're not contained in this manuscript that we're looking at, and it's something that's getting out of fashion throughout the Middle Ages. The main event when piyutim are being said is the morning service on Shabbat, but especially on holidays, where we have piyutim embellishing the Shema Yisrael and large compositions for the Amidah. On days when we have an additional prayer, Musaf, there can be piyutim for the Amidah, but only on high holidays. And then in Mincha, it's very, very rare to even have piyutim. But we also have piyutim on Yom Kippur, in Mincha, and we do have them in Ne'ilah, the last service. So because our manuscript contains Yom Kippur, that is the main section, because that is where everything is happening. We have, as I said before, a damaged manuscript, so we have only Musaf, the last service that has piyutim, for the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Then we have the full second day with Shacharit and Musaf. We have Yom Kippur with 5 different services. And then on Sukkot, we have the first day, Shacharit, the second day, Shacharit. We have the intermediate Shabbat, actually, with 1 piyut. And then we have both of the services on Shemini Atzeret, Shacharit and Musaf, but Musaf is actually breaking off. That is what we're looking at. So the volume, as I said, would have covered Rosh Hashanah to Simchat Torah, and it would have had a companion that would probably have begun not on Chanukah, as we would expect today, but on the 4 special Sabbaths before Passover. And it would have ended probably with Shavuot, although we do have some manuscripts that do contain the 9th of Av in the summer volume as well. And then there would have been another companion volume in that community that would have the slichot, the penitential prayers that are said in the months before Rosh Hashanah, and especially in the time between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. What we have to see in this manuscript is that while we have one manuscript that really tells one story that's complete in the way that it's working, it was written by 2 different hands. So there was an interruption in the middle of one of the compositions for Yom Kippur. Another hand took over, another scribe, using another type of quill, but also using another type of parchment. So we can actually see in the physical manuscript that more than one person contributed to creating this volume, and that probably there was some kind of an interruption in the production of the manuscript. Manuscripts were produced on commission. Individuals would ask for a manuscript to be written. And in this case, apparently the commission could not be completely fulfilled by one person, and another person took part in this. Both of them used the same principles of writing the text, and that is what we'll see in the second unit. So in this unit, we're going to look at the different texts that we have in the Mahzor manuscript, that is prayer and liturgical poetry. Prayer is recited by everybody, and therefore everybody knows it by heart, and therefore it does not need to be contained in the Mahzor in the same way that the texts that not everybody is reciting and that not everybody knows are contained. But it gives the frame for where the liturgical poetry is attached to. So even the earliest manuscripts give us some keywords to say, this is the prayer that we're saying here. This is at this moment in the prayer, the liturgical poetry should be inserted. And actually there are variants in the prayers on the high holidays, on other festivals. And some of these variants will also be included in the Mahzor. But since that is standard prayer, it will be written in prose text. The Chazan is supposed to know how is to recite these texts. There's no need to beautify the structure of the text. There's no need to make it visually attractive or helpful for the person who's reading it. That's completely different when we're looking at liturgical poetry. Piyut, it's a Hebrew word made out of the original Greek poiesis, is very, very structured poetry. We have stanzas, we have rhyme. Actually, Hebrew liturgical poetry is the first literature that continuously employs rhyme, earlier than Latin or Greek. But it also has some other poetic features that will help the Chazan to recite it in a beautiful way. This is sung. Has to be very beautiful. When we're looking at the contents of it, though, it is especially Ashkenazic poetry, specific for single occasions. So we have actually for every specific service, for every prayer that's being embellished by poetry, we have different texts. There's no repetition there. So they have all to be copied into the manuscript. In Ashkenaz, they really liked poetry that is complicated, very difficult language. They had fun when the things had special sounds and so on. So this is something that is a challenge to the Chazan, who has to present these texts in a way that they're understandable to people whose Hebrew is probably not that good. By the Middle Ages, Hebrew was not the active language anymore. The manuscript, when they're trying to present the prayers, will skip certain parts, as I said, and they can abbreviate it. They can use rubrics. They can say, like, this is the text that we have that's different from another holiday, and then it will continue with text that everybody knows, so they will only give the initial words of the prayer. So it could say Avinu Malchenu, it could say now we're saying Kaddish, and that would be mixed in between the stage directions of when the community would be sitting, when the Chazan would be standing, who would be going where, and so on. None of that when we have poetry. The writing of poetry is about the way that it can be read. So stanzas need to be marked. Rhyme needs to be marked. Any other kind of structural form will be needed to visualized. So when we have stanzas that have lines that are very repetitive, that have specific structure in the line, that will be visible in the manuscript. Stanzas will begin with a word in larger script. Sometimes we have a refrain that will be added, will be shown as being in a different handwriting. Some manuscripts actually work with colored ink to show specific structures. The manuscript that we're looking at is doing it only by the size of letters and the way words are and lines are arranged on the manuscript. It's amazing how the structure of lines, how rhyme really is visible on these pages. And modern Mahzorim don't do that all the time. As I said, piyutim were sung, so there's melodies, but we do not have musical notation in medieval Ashkenazic manuscripts. The maxim that we have in some manuscripts, not in this one that we're looking at, will be a superscription saying this text is being sung on the same melody that another very famous piyut is being sung on. What we have, and that is rather unusual, is not only catchwords added by a later hand saying This is where we introduce the refrain, which has been written once in the originals by the original scribe at the beginning of the poem. And then the original scribe assumes that because the structure of the text is actually visible, everybody will see that this is where the refrain has to be inserted. But a later hand actually added that in a lot of the piyutim. Either that same person or another user, another chazan that was working with that manuscript, added marks in several of the piyutim highlighting the penultimate stanza in a piyut. So this is when he's getting into like the last tremolo, the last lines of the poem. And in order to make performance more dramatic, you would need to know where actually to set in with a different kind of melody. And so we see that, although we don't have the musical notation for the performance. The manuscript also visualizes at least one or two elements that are not necessarily visible or audible to the audience, that don't need to be marked for the chazan. And that is biblical verses that can occur in structured positions, like at the end of a stanza, there would be a quotation from the Bible. And he's marking that by using a different script. Some of the manuscripts actually use different ink to mark that. And what we see a lot is marking the acrostic. Hebrew poetry already in the 6th century employed acrostic as an almost standard device. The stanzas of poems or the lines of poems begin with letters that make up some sort of an order. The first order that we have is the alphabet, and already the biblical psalms have that in some cases. And then later on, by the 5th century, actually the first poets had the idea, instead of using the alphabet, to use their own names. And the manuscript shows that. So it will have larger letters or gaps in the lines in order to mark where the acrostic is. Be it the alphabetic acrostic, be it the upside down alphabetic acrostic starting from the last letter of the alphabet, but a lot of it also the names of the poets. Some other Ashkenazic manuscripts actually write superscripts and saying this piyut is by that and that author. Our manuscript does not do that, but the scribe is taking a lot of care to visualize the names of the paitanim, of the poets that are part of the acrostic. And he's, in one case, really adding a little swirl to every one, a little flower to every letter. And in a few cases, he's actually going further than doing it only at the beginning of his lines. He is, in sections that he's writing as rhymed prose, figuring out where he should put a mark on the name of so you can read the name of the poet. There's no way that anybody could have heard that. But it's simply part of the art of poetry, and it's something that he wants to have and that he sees as a part of the decoration of not only the poetry, but also of the manuscript. Which brings us to decoration. The normal way in Ashkenazic Mahzorim to decorate would be to decorate the initial words of units. Units would be piyutim, and more so even the beginning of a service or even the beginning of a day. We'll have initial words, not initial letters as in the Christian tradition. And since our scribe is actually working mainly with black ink, we have a little flourishes around the letters in the black ink. Unlike several other manuscripts, we don't have drawings of animals or people around initial words. We do have in the second half, or really very close to the end, in the middle of Sukkot, a few initials that have red decoration. And on the sides of the word Hosha'ana, which begins a section of piyutim for Hoshana Rabbah, there actually are little drawings in black and red ink. Something is very unusual about this manuscript is that the decoration includes the vowel signs that are written underneath the letters. Normally, in order to write a Hebrew text, you write the consonants, and then a second person, or in a second step of work, with a much thinner quill, you need to write out the vowels, which are just like these dots and lines underneath the letters. And because that's happening in a second step, it's not normally part of the decoration scheme of an initial word. It's simply added after the decoration is done. This manuscript, however, is different. In several cases, in the initial words, the vowels become part of the decoration. It's especially obvious in one case in a piyut for Shemini Atzeret, where actually there's large red circles around the vowels of the word Shemini. That is actually, as a decoration, a very harmless way of doing a manuscript. We don't see color yet, we don't see gilding, we don't see illustrations, anything like that. So there's only one initial panel in that whole manuscript that's actually using color. It's positioned at the beginning of the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And we see the first piyut that's beginning with Melech actually has this beautiful panel around it in different colors with a little margin around it. And since we don't have the beginnings of the other days, we might assume that several others of these panels might have existed, and we'll talk about that in the last section. What we do see, and that is very unusual for panels which exist in a lot of other manuscripts, is that the vowel signs are again part of the decoration. Not only do we have the dots of the segol sign underneath the panel, we also have on the top of the panel a line for the rafeh, for the line that actually says like this last consonant is not a k but a ch, and that we don't see in any other manuscript. Apparently this scribe really was fond of vocalization. He also is fond of another very specific thing, and that happens in both parts of the manuscript. The second scribe picks it up from what the first one does, and that is a very tall lamed. The letter usually goes above the line, but in this manuscript it actually goes way above the line. It's taller and it's growing out of the panel in this case. Panels, as I said, are not unusual in Ashkenazic manuscripts, and this one is nice, but it's in no way as elaborate as in other manuscripts. And the perfect example of how very, very detailed these decorations can be is the Nuremberg Mahzor, copied in 1331, probably in Regensburg, where we see a lot more detail. Both manuscripts share a dislike for any other kind of illumination. So we don't have people, we don't have animals that happen to be around a lot in other liturgical manuscripts. Now, in the Nuremberg Mahzor, a lot of the initial words are gilded. And there's actually one gilded word in our manuscript as well. And that is at what today is considered the most impressive service of all. That's Kol Nidre. And the first word, Kol, is actually gilded, both of the letters. There's no other decoration, just the gold as like this is an important page. And the text is written by far larger than in any of the other pages. So we could envision the Chazan actually stepping back, raising his voice, projecting into the room, and still being able to read this, although it is so much text and he's further away from it, because it's simply written bigger. But it also shows that the text is important at that time. And we'll look at other ways that the Chazan is interacting with the manuscript in the next section. So in this unit, we're going to talk about the different Ashkenazic prayer rites and how to recognize them. And of course, I've already given away that this is a Western Ashkenazic manuscript, but still, let's have a look at the different rites that we have within Ashkenaz. And we'll only talk about Ashkenaz. There's a lot of other rites out there in Europe, be there in Italy, which has two different rites, Spain, the Byzantine Empire, and so on. The prayers in all the Ashkenazic rites are the same. So if you're looking for a difference, don't go looking for the prayers, because they have to be the same. They're coming into Ashkenaz through the same channels, and everybody's using the same prayers. What we do see differences between the different rites are the liturgical poems, the piyutim. The basic assumption is that we're talking about two larger Ashkenazic rites, a Western Ashkenazic rite and an Eastern Ashkenazic rite. And then we should also mention Northern France, because that is very much related to the Western Ashkenazic rite. And the Northern French rite then influences England, whereas the Eastern Ashkenazic rite influences whatever we have eastwards of the German-speaking countries, in Poland, what is today the Czech Republic, and many other areas as well, including Austria, which in medieval times actually had a rite of its own called Minhag Austria. The difference between the piyutim in the different rites are not spread evenly throughout the services. There's a history of how piyutim actually come to Ashkenaz, and the earlier they're coming, the more determined their status in the liturgy is. So all Ashkenazic minhagim have certain piyutim by a poet by the name of Elisabeth, Rabbi Kalir, who lived in 7th century Israel under Byzantine rule. And his piyutim came to Italy before the Arab conquest of Israel. And then they actually went with Jews immigrating into the Rhineland to Ashkenaz. And there they're becoming the core part of the Ashkenazic liturgy. The later the piyutim get, the more variance there actually is. Because if somebody's writing a poem in 12th century Mainz, not everybody in 12th century Regensburg will want to include that into their liturgy, and the other way around. So the later the texts are, the more differences we have. But it's also a question of the position within the Mahzor. Like I said, wherever we have a piyut of Kalir, there's no way that it can be changed. We have his piyutim only for the first days of holidays. So that actually changes then the options for the second day. And we only have variants in the second days, mainly between the Western Ashkenazic and the French rite, less so with the Eastern Ashkenazic rite. When we're looking at holidays that were introduced later, or that got their embellishment even later in the history of the Ashkenazic liturgy, there's a lot more possibilities for variation. So, second Shabbat in Hanukkah is a date for which we don't have any kind of unity, but also the Shabbatot between Pesach and Shavuot, where in the 11th century and the 12th century, actually only the idea came up to have them embellished with poems. There's another way of variation, and that is in any occasion when you have more than one piyut that is being inserted at the same time. So into the piyutim for the Amidah on Yom Kippur, Slichot are inserted, penitentiary poems. On the 9th of Av, it's Kinot, laments. And on other occasions, it's like Hoshanot, the special piyutim that praise God in Sukkot. When we have more than one piyut, we can actually have a whole group, and then we can reorder them, and elements can be taken out of that group, elements can be reordered. So there's a lot of variance there. The most variant that we have is actually with life cycle events. Apparently these were composed for people. So we have at least 17 different compositions for the Shabbat of the wedding week, and we have 4 different compositions for the Shabbat of the circumcision week. So there is a difference there, and that is where variant is visible, not only between these large rites, but even between smaller units. And then we can go and say, like, we have a local rite in a specific place. We do know the local rites of Mainz, which is very well documented in manuscripts. We do know them from Worms and from some other cities like Cologne. We do not know which city the Mahzor that we're talking about is coming from, because it does not have a rite that can really be determined to be in a specific city. So how do we know that it is from a Western Ashkenazic rite? Let's take the example of Sukkot, simply because that is a small unit to be looking at. The first way to look is to see if there are major differences between the different rites. So if you're looking from Western Ashkenaz, even further west, into France, what kind of differences are there? Or if we're looking into the other direction, to the east, what kind of differences are there? We would start with the major compositions, because that is where the changes could be. So the composition for Shema Yisrael in the morning service on the first or second day of Sukkot, they're actually different compositions. Both are by Elisabeth Rabbi Kilir, whom I mentioned, because he brought in a lot of his poetry was actually brought to Ashkenaz for Sukkot. For the first day and for the second day, there's an order. There's normally a piyut called Achtir Zir Tehillah on the first day. And on the second day, there is another piyut called Eretz Nora. Our manuscript has the opposite order. That is an order that's only transmitted in the Northern French Rite. So by finding one indication that the manuscript could be from Northern France, although the paleography doesn't really support that, we will need to find out what happened in this case. Why do we have this strange order? The order actually is even stranger, because it has what we would expect on the second day, on the first day. It then has the text that we would expect for the second day, for the first day, but with a rubric saying that this is only if the first day happens on a Shabbat. And then we have another copy of the text for the second day. So something clearly got messed up. It's even more complicated if we're looking at which scribe is writing what, because it seems that the first copy of the piyut that is normally said on the second day was actually done by the first scribe, who never got that far into the manuscript. We also see that it actually occurs immediately after the piyutim for the last service of Yom Kippur, on the same page, where we would not expect a new text to begin. We would expect a new holiday to begin on a new leaf. So something clearly is confusing here. And the user was actually looking at this at some point and adding notes to change the rite and to identify the rite, completely got confused and wrote on top of one of the piyutim that this is being said only when the piyut is said on a Shabbat, on the first day of Sukkot, which is not something that we have in any other rite. So the conclusion from this is most likely not France, but simply a very complicated situation, very specific to this manuscript, and not anything that we can locate. So if we want to check against the options of Northern French, we would have to go to other cases where we have differences that we can find in the printed Mahzorim between Western Ashkenaz and Northern France. And in the piyut for the Amidah on the second day of Sukkot, we actually find that, because in that composition, the last of the piyutim, we have differences between what we see in Ashkenazic manuscript from Western Ashkenaz and from Northern French West. And we do see in our manuscript very clearly that we have Kiekach, which is the text that we expect in Western Ashkenaz. And there's a lot of other differences between the Northern French Rite and the one in Western Ashkenaz in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where we find that our manuscript actually goes with the Western tradition. So we know it's Western Ashkenaz, or we know it's Ashkenaz. How do we know it's not the Eastern Ashkenazic tradition? Again, we do have variants in the piyutim, even in the Kalirian piyutim, where the Eastern Ashkenazic rite does make slight differences. One of the cases is a part of the Piyutim for Amidah, where the Eastern Ashkenazic rite simply leaves out a certain piyut that's attached to a phrase in the prayer, Elna. In only Ashkenazic manuscripts from the West actually have poetic embellishment for this section. And all the Eastern manuscripts leave that out. So because our manuscript has it, we're clearly identifying it as being part of the Western Ashkenazic rite. So what can we actually say about the place where the manuscript was produced? It was a Western Ashkenazic community that gets us basically to the Rhineland, a little bit east of the Rhineland, but already like the lower part of the Danube, or the lower German-speaking part of the Danube, Regensburg, is part of the Eastern Ashkenazic tradition. And if you're going up from Regensburg, simply up to the North Sea, we're actually having some kind of the border between the Western and the Eastern Ashkenazic rite. Or, as some colleagues like to argue, it is something about when Jewish communities are actually settling in these areas. It is a community that's able to afford a beautiful Mahzor, probably in 2 volumes, in the 14th century, which is not exactly the richest time of medieval Ashkenazic culture, although a lot of manuscripts are produced in that time. But that it does not have this kind of rich people who would invest in a manuscript that is very lavishly decorated. There may be some connection to a Northern French tradition, which we see in this mix-up with the Piyutim for Sukkot. So we could imagine, for example, Northern French refugees after the expulsion of Jews from France in 1306, coming to the community and influencing the liturgy there. It doesn't happen very often, but it is a possibility that there actually is some kind of notice of the Northern French rite, which we also see in communities around Cologne. We know that it's not from one of the big local traditions, Mainz, Worms, Speyer, Cologne. And we can say that the community was not at all influential when it came to the determination of the printed rite, because actually printed Mahzorim contain notes for bigger communities. They will say, like in Frankfurt, one uses it in that order. And none of that is actually available for this change that we're seeing for Sukkot, which is the main difference that we have from the normal Western Ashkenazic rite when we're looking at the larger Piyutim. And I'm not going to look now with you at the Slichot, because there every community and every manuscript, even from the same community, has the different order of the text. So we don't have parallels to exactly that rite. We will see that this manuscript actually got adapted to the standard rite, and that is what we'll look at in the next unit. So in this unit, we're going to look how a manuscript actually adapted to the changes in the rite. And the manuscript that we're looking at is actually a perfect example for this, because it has a lot of marginal notes, a lot of ways of adapting to things, to changes. There's a lot of need for change. Apparently, scribes were not the people who did not make mistakes. There are scribal mistakes in liturgical manuscripts, but it's not good for the performance of the text. So the person who's reading it out loud wants to have the best possible text. But in addition to that, there's also interest in variant readings of the Piyutim, because the consonants of the text can actually be read with different sets of vowels, or there could be changes of individual words that might have another meaning. In addition to that, we have changes really in the liturgy, not so many, but actually we do have. And for all of that, we have marginal notes that have very different forms, but one main function. They're trying to keep the manuscript usable for that one person who's actually dealing with it. So we assume that the people who are writing on the margin of these manuscripts actually are the chazanim, the users of the manuscript, who are adapting it to their personal need. But the first person who's changing the manuscript is the scribe. who would make mistakes and who had the option of erasing words that he wrote and copying them again. And we see that a lot in medieval manuscript. But if he saw it too late, he could also simply cross out the word or mark the word with dots to be not read and put in the correct word on the margin of the manuscript. And that is the first person to actually use the margin of the manuscript. And then a lot of other people come in. The second person may be actually the scribe himself, but in another function, in the function of that person who's adding the vowels. Because Hebrew is written only in consonants, and we have these beautiful large letters in the Ashkenazic square script, written with a wide quill, in thick letters. The vowels that tend to be so much thinner need to be written with a small quill, so that is a second step of work. And it seems from all that we know of manuscript that it was actually done not page by page, but at least quire by quire, so with a certain distance from writing the text. Or it could be done, and we have example of that, by different people whose specialization, whose trade was to put in vowels into texts. So if they saw a mistake, they would skip vocalizing that word and would put their corrections in the margin. And we have a few examples in our codex here, but actually the vocalization here is so unusual that I would not trust that Nagdan, that vocalizer. On the other hand, we have people who are trying to reorganize the text in order to work for their liturgy. And they will add their notes, they will add letters in the margin, they will try to work out a way of using that manuscript in the best possible sense. Adding text in the margin, adding short notes in the margin. And one of the most interesting example probably is when the scribe wrongly copied a text using the introduction to a text, instead of using the introduction to a text, actually copying the refrain. Apparently he himself just threw a line through it and then made a marker where to start again in the text. It's looking very, very modern actually in the way that he's dealing with a manuscript. He's not crossing out, he's not erasing, he's simply a thin line but marking where to start again. That is one of the most invisible changes actually of the manuscript. Marginal notes do a lot of other things. So corrections that we have would be when somebody thought a word or a phrase was missing in the text because the original scribe jumped over a phrase. And that does happen a lot because in the liturgical texts we get a lot of repetitions and we get formula. And scribes get used to these formula, and then if there's a variant of that, they will miss out on something or similar things. So, for example, on folio 12 verso, we have a missing word that were added in a later hand in a prayer. And of course, prayers are so standard that everybody should know them by heart. So the scribe really messed up, but the reader felt the need to actually have the correct text in front of him, so he's not reciting by heart. Another example is when the scribe abbreviated elements. So, for example, on folio 67 verso, the original scribe, after a period, said there's no need to really repeat a lot of the text that he's saying. So he says, from here you recite like on other days, from, and then he gives the initial phrase, ubemakalot, and the end of the phrase, which is to be recited again, Gedol betushbachot. A later hand thought that this last phrase was not enough, apparently thinking that the person who was greatly praised is not enough of an indication where in the liturgy it should be go. So he added the full bracha at this case to indicate until which phrase it should be said. He didn't write the full text out. He just needed the end to make sure that this is where the transition is back into the written text that we have. And another example that shows how notes were actually used in order to complete the text happens on another folio where the half Kaddish is copied, and the original scribe actually tried to squeeze in a lot of text into one line. And at some point he realizes that these 7 words that he has before a new unit is beginning don't fit into the line. And he only abbreviates the first 3 words of them, and that assumes that since this is a text that everybody is reciting, that's recited several times within the liturgy, everybody would know how to complete that. But a later user of the manuscript actually added all the missing words in the white margin that he had available. And he really took care to write in a large square script, almost the size of the script of the original hand, making sure that this is actually the full text that he wanted to have there, as if there could be anybody who doesn't know that text by heart, or assuming that you really have to recite certain prayers from the written text, not by heart. That is one of the ways of correcting things in the margins. Other things that happen in the margins are variant readings. Now, these never happen in prayers. Prayers have a fixed text that you can correct, but you cannot offer another reading. Whereas when it comes to liturgical poetry, these are not fixed texts. Well, the authors probably wanted them to be fixed, but the medieval readers actually knew that there were variants around in other manuscripts. And sometimes we find remarks on the page that mark a single word in a line and say, like, in another book, Sefer Acher, we have that and that variant. They're not corrections, they're simply offering another reading. We even know from later Piyut commentaries that this is a lot of what was happening, that individuals had their own way of reading the text, and then that would get noted down as one of the ways of reading this. In our manuscript, there's some of the variants that we have are actually known from other manuscripts, and others are not. So on one folio, we have a textual variant that actually restores the text to what we have now in the modern critical edition, which assumes that that is the intention of the author, although the majority of medieval manuscripts actually don't have the text that the critical edition thinks is correct. And our manuscript doesn't have that in the first hand, but somebody corrected the text to this, assuming it was the correct one, and the critical editor actually in the 20th century agreed with him. There's one very unusual example for variants, and that is on one of the earliest folios that exist in this codex, in a very, very well-known piyut, Unetane Tokev. And within very few lines, we have 4 marginal notes offering different readings. And 3 of them change the way that the verb is read. Unetane Tokev at that point has a long list of saying, like, God is the one who will decide who is being punished, who is being given better things. And it's a long list of simply synonyms for the good side and the bad side. And a few of the verbs that are used for the benefit that people get are actually rather hard to translate. So modern translation will say, like, who will live in harmony, who will enjoy tranquility, who will be exalted, showing that these are not normal verbs where you something can, who does X or who does Y. So the manuscript already has unusual forms, that we see that the original scribe was actually thinking in a different form of the verb, is thinking in a causative, and the vocalization goes along with that. It's a vocalization that's completely against what we have in all other traditions of that piyut. And then somebody really thought this can't work, and he added the variant readings in the margin, but he added a vocalization that goes into the passive. So instead of like, who will enjoy tranquility, it would be like, who will be tranquilized? Really strange forms that cannot be correct. And it shows that whoever was correcting there understood that something was wrong, but was not good enough in Hebrew grammar to really come up with the correct form. So corrections or variant readings don't always give you the better reading of a text. Other things that can happen in the margins are the reordering of text or the ordering of multiple texts. I've said in another unit that we have several piyutim in certain cases inserted in the same place, like the slichot, the penitentiary prayers, and similar things. And manuscript do number them. And then, of course, they can simply add a marginal note that says, like, we actually don't use them in the original order, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, they're counted in Hebrew letters, but we say, and then they give the order of the units as it is actually being used. We don't have a reordering of the slichot in our manuscript, but we do see remnants in the cut margins of the numbering of the slichot. So the option was there. They could decide, no, we don't say all 15 texts that we have, we're only saying a few numbers. And then the Chazan could simply have like a little note saying, these are the ones that I'm needing to read, and he could leaf through the manuscript and find them. In some manuscripts that are dedicated to these kind of slichot and collections, we actually then find lists saying, in our city, the correct rite is X and Y. There's one example in our text that shows that this kind of reordering actually goes beyond the ordering of complete texts. There's a change between the early Ashkenazic liturgy and then the later liturgy in Musaf on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, where biblical verses are recited and the order in which they're to be recited changes. We have a written text from the 14th century that says they should be recited in a given order by a very important scholar who gets very influential in Ashkenaz, Maharil. And the manuscript reorders the text that is written already in the main manuscript by adding, again, little Hebrew letters in the margin indicating which of the 4 sentences is to be said as first. And so, while most medieval manuscripts don't have the order that is being used in the late suggestion for the Minhag by Maharil, but they have another order than the one that we have here in front of us. So again, our manuscript is kind of unique, unusual, but a later hand adds those little notes in the margin saying we need to follow the rite as everybody else. We need to follow the rite that Maharil suggests. And we actually find similar occasions where Maharil is being followed in a lot of pages of this manuscript, where simply somebody goes and says, like, this is not what it should be, and he adds the correct text. He says, we don't say this, we do that. And these always go with the late Western Ashkenazic Minhag as presented by Maharil. Part of the changes that we have are addition to the text. And I already mentioned that this one scribe actually adds text to the margins where he thinks that things should be changed. And one of the examples for that is on folio 99 recto, where we have a piyut that is not said in all communities in early medieval rites. Those communities that don't say it have 2 lines of text instead of that piyut. The late medieval rite says, like, you do both. You say the piyut and then you add that other text. And so our commentator, the person who's adding the notes, actually writes down these 2 lines after the piyut so that they can recite it to be recited in his community together with the piyut. So it's like adding a bit of text in order to make his version of the Mahzor usable according to that late rite. In some cases, we actually get additional information, and there's a very, very late hand at play that adds even more information at places we just don't expect it from medieval hands. The ink is different. It's brownish, it's bleached, not adding enough carbon to the manuscript, to the ink. It's a late hand, probably 18th century even, square, beautiful, taking very much care of writing. And it adds the introduction of prayers for Musaf and Mincha on Yom Kippur. At the beginning, before the piyutim start, which are really what a medieval manuscript starts a service with, because they assume that you do know the prayers. So somebody here is trying to keep the manuscript in use, somebody who's not familiar with the whole set of prayers, and who figures he has to give himself a reminder, because this is not all of the text that should be recited. It is a reminder that's added at a time when printed Mahzorim were available, and where apparently somebody thought that prayer rite was better or nicer if the Chazan was using this manuscript and not a printed book in front of him. Adding is not the only way that you can change a text. There's a lot of exclusions of longer text from the rite because piyutim are becoming less and less fashionable, or because other piyutim are inserted instead of a certain piyut. There is a certain kind of fluctuation there, and that's actually very easy to note in a manuscript, because just next to the beginning of the piyut, somebody adds the Hebrew words ein omrim or ein omrim ze. One does not say this. It's very easy to implement, and apparently because the initial words are big enough, having something written next to them makes the Chazan take care, makes him realize that he can skip this. So sometimes this ein omrim is really almost illegible. In Italy, we also have the crossing out of texts. Simply going through the text that is not to be said, and then beginning the line again on the first letter of the text that is to be said. That is not something that we see in manuscripts that have stayed in Germany for all the time. So this is an indication that the manuscript that we have with us was used in Germany. It did not go with the German Jewish emigres to Italy like so many of the manuscripts that we have. The other people who are crossing out texts are censors, and we'll have to speak about censorship in the last unit. One of the amazing features of this manuscript is that although the margins were cut, certain things were retained on the margins, and one of them is an example of the exchange of one piyut for another. So you have here on folio 143 recto, next to the initial word of the piyut that begins with ata, it says ein omrim ze. One does not say that. And then the same hand that takes out one piyut from the liturgy adds another piyut, carefully written in a small script, almost illegible if you're not very close to the text. And in order to fit it onto the margin, he actually has to abbreviate the refrain. But he assumes that this is necessary to have it in the same manuscript, and he takes care to write small enough to get everything onto the same page and to vocalize his text. So we do have really an adaptation to the later rite, and again, this is something that we find in Minhagei Maharil, in this 14th century interpretation of how prayers should be said. So we get all these marginal notes on the manuscript, and they're doing a lot of things in order to make the manuscript usable according to the rite. This is all writing. There are a few physical interventions into the manuscript, and we will look at those in the next unit. So our last section is on physical interventions into the manuscript. So we're really only looking at this manuscript from the cut center, although a lot of the items that are happening there can happen in other manuscripts as well. The first type of intervention is really by outsiders, and by that I mean censors. Christians did not like certain texts from the Jewish liturgy, and they tried to censor them. We know that very well from Italy, where in the 16th century they actually had censors who needed to see every Hebrew manuscript. They crossed out passages, they inked out passages, and then they had to sign on the manuscript that they changed. We don't have that in Ashkenaz. What we do have is the erasure of certain texts and texts that people felt offended by. The perfect example for that is the Aleinu, where Jews actually thanking God for not being part of the other people who worship powerless idols. And obviously Christianity felt offended by being called worshiping powerless idols, and they even assumed that some of the wording in that text was hiddenly alluding to Jesus as being empty and all kinds of images for powerlessness. And we do have Jewish exegesis that actually sees it in that same way, so the Christians may not be completely wrong. And we have a lot of intervention when it comes to the Aleinu. Sometimes we have manuscripts that never ever covered it. Our manuscript actually did write it, and it has it twice. On folio 8 verso, there is an erasure of the offending sentences. But then, on folio 155, where it goes from the recto to the verso side, the two sentences that say that non-Jews pray to powerless idols stay in the manuscript. So we don't have a complete kind of censure, but we have that kind of intervention trying to get rid of certain texts. This is even stronger in the other case that's very, very visible in this manuscript. In Yom Kippur, there are two piyutim that are very, very derogatory of Christians. The first one basically says that Christians worship idols and that Jesus is a stinking carcass. And it's very, very explicit in the terminology. It was written in the 7th century in Israel under Byzantine rule, so under Christian rule. And there is a whole tradition of fight between the different religions there and of polemics. On folio 105, this piyut is being cut out. The interesting thing is that when you cut out a text, you're actually cutting out a text on the other side as well. So a later hand, or what is later, a hand of the 15th century, probably 15th or early 16th century, added the lines that were cut from the piyut on the recto side of the manuscript, where the offending piyut was like on the bottom of the verso side, and he added that not to the folio where something was cut from, but to the next folio, so that before turning the leaf, you would actually see on the margin of the next side the text that was missing here. And only then you had to turn the leaf and continue with that non-offending piyut, praising the greatness of God, before coming to the moment where actually the text was cut. Now, the text that was cut was not only those few lines that are here visible on folio 105. So they cut another full leaf from the manuscript, cutting out texts that were not added in some form or another by the later scribe. So apparently there's some interest in the text, but not so much that somebody really restores all of those texts that were cut out that were not necessary. Something similar happens a few leaves further on folio 108, where again the few lines from the previous period that are missing are added by that same hand, and then whatever's on the additional page that is being cut is actually not existent. We can kind of date that cutting because of the hand that's adding the marginal note. And that is late 15th to early 16th century, and that is a typical time for Christian intervention into Jewish manuscripts. The interesting thing is that we have these marginal notes, and when the manuscript was rebound at some point and the margins were cut, these notes were cut. So the texts that were being completed again in order to be able to recite them had been taken out of the liturgy by the time that the manuscript was rebound, because else you would have had to take care that these marginal notes would actually, like, in some way be continued and used in the manuscript. So we have some kind of a dating of that kind of censure somewhere in the 16th century, probably, and not so in a time when these piyutim were still said. That rebinding and cutting of the margin was due apparently to a fire in the place where the manuscript was kept. Parchment does not burn easily, so it must have been like a major fire, not just a fallen candle or something like that. And we do have scorch marks still left on some of the pages. And from the fold out of those places where texts had to be preserved, we can actually see that there's at least 1.8 inches, almost 2 inches of margin cut. And that would be how deep the fire got into the manuscript. We would also assume that the beginning and the end of the manuscript, these squares missing, the first services of the first day of Rosh Hashanah and then all of Simchat Torah, were damaged through that fire. So after the fire, somebody goes and invests a lot of time preserving the manuscript, rebinding it, and going through it page by page, checking the marginal notes, marking those that they want to keep by cutting on their sides and then folding them inside into the manuscript before then all of the rest of the margins can be cut to the current size that we have. So that person decides which commentaries to keep, which notes to keep, which not. We can reconstruct which texts were still in use in his time. And we have to assume that at that time, a lot of the piyutim were actually not so much en vogue anymore, and that he was not interested in certain types of commentary. That leads to the assumption that the fire and the rebinding of the volume was done at a time when somebody still wanted to use a manuscript Mahzor with a lot of those texts. So we're before the big liturgy reform, but at a time when another part of this lengthy recitation of piyutim had already been abolished. So we're probably talking about the early 18th century, although a study of the cover of the volume, and probably in some cases the ink of the last marks, that the last annotations that were added, might help us to do that dating a little bit more correct. That was not the last intervention to the manuscript. A few pages are missing that were cut from the Mahzor, probably after it was rebound. These were the first pages of Ne'ilah, of the second day of Sukkot, and of Shemini Atzeret. So by being the first leaves of a certain service, they're obviously like the decorated pages. We saw the panel for the second day of Rosh Hashanah, And we have to assume that decorations like that, or even more lavish, had existed in the manuscript and were cut out. This is not unusual. Decorated manuscript pages exist on the market, and they have been existing there for a long time. The 19th century is full of people cutting out illustrations from manuscripts already in the 19th century, and there's some people saying that actually started in the 18th century. We do not know exactly when these pages were cut. We have one indication, and that is on the page just before the missing first leaf of Ne'ilah. A late hand added the first piyut of Ne'ilah. So he's restoring the manuscript in order to use it, in order to have the full text, although it's hardly legible if you're standing in front of the manuscript and trying to recite in it in a service. But still, he's trying to make the manuscript usable again. And the hand can be dated to the 19th century. He's using, again, an ink that is without added carbon, just a gel ink that gets brown over time. He's not using a wide quill. He may actually even already be using a metal quill, a writing instrument that is so modern and that does not make the difference between a wide and a thin line in a manuscript. So we have some time that we can assume that these pages were cut, and that they were cut actually for selling at a time when the use of the Mahzor was in debate. And that essentially is the time of liturgy reform. First reforms are starting in the beginning of the 19th century. The first reform prayer book is printed in 1819. And we do know that in the same time, while people were trying to reform liturgy, others were trying to stay with the old liturgy. So we could see that intervention, that adding of the piyut into the margins of the page before the leaf that was cut out, as an attempt to restore the Orthodox rite in a time when the Mahzor itself had become so unimportant for some people that they considered it possible to cut out leaves and sell them. I would like to show you one last cutout in this manuscript, which is unusual in that somebody did not cut out a full page, but only the assumedly illustrated panel that held the initial word. And what you're seeing here is the patch, the parchment patch added into that cut out hole on the manuscript side, with the restoration of the initial word, imitating the decoration of letters that we have in the very same manuscript, in a very, very professional way. It's like patching parchment is not easy. Whoever was doing this was actually knowing what he did. And he used parchment, not paper, which was far easier to get at that time. And he took care to also fill in the text on the other side so that we can actually leaf through the manuscript, use the manuscript as if nothing happened. If we're only interested in the text and not in the material quality or the illuminations or anything like that, we can read the piyut as it were. Somebody clearly took care to, while doing harm to the manuscript, leaving its textual base for recitation in synagogue available. So that would probably be before those whole pages were cut out, but not much more, because why would anybody cut out a panel and keep it somewhere, hang it in his apartment, whatever, just saying et, the beginning of an accusative, et Hashem Nirbat, the honored name, but just having the et, which cannot translate into anything. So it must have been beautiful, but the assumption is that this is not something that you can really well sell. It's a strange question why that happened, but it's another example that the history of each of these manuscripts is important.
In this course, we've used the Katz Center Mahzor to study how to study a liturgical manuscript. We've seen that the combination of text tells us a lot about where a manuscript was from. We've seen that variants, and especially marginal notes, can add to that information about the community that used the manuscripts. And we've also seen that the object itself, marginal notes, but also cuts, deletions, other kind of damage, does tell us more about the history of the manuscript. If the manuscript had more artwork, we would have looked at that as well in order to determine more about the manuscript, where it is from, how rich the community was, who ordered it, and so forth. A lot can be learned about each liturgical manuscript, the Katz Center manuscript being but one example. I hope to have inspired you to look at some of these questions and to think of some of these aspects when next you see a liturgical manuscript, or even a printed Mahzor, or even participate in prayer.